Hi everybody! In this video we will explore Iranian and Venezuelan sanctioned oil, natural gas and petroleum products markets and possible effect that lifting of the sanctions can have on the global markets. Both countries trade a minimum amount of oil, natural gas and petroleum products despite of the sanctions. Some of the quantities have been smuggled to countries that don't respect Western sanctions – China, India and Russia. If the sanctions will be lifted, then the quantities may be increased and substitute the global supply from Russia. In that way, prices wouldn't rise, we all can have enough oil, natural gas and petroleum products, and everything on that market could stay stable and nice. At the same time, Russia can find itself without oil, natural gas and petroleum products revenues, and we all know what that means. End of the threat from Russia to Ukraine and Europe. According to the OPEC annual report, world crude oil production increased from 68 million barrels a day in 2020 to 72 million barrels a day in 2024. Iranian crude oil production increased from 1.9 million barrels a day in 2020 to 3.2 million barrels a day in 2024. So, world crude oil production increased 5% and Iranian crude oil production increased 63% from 2020 to 2024, despite of the low quantities. Venezuelan crude oil production increased from 569,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 921,000 barrels a day in 2024. So world crude oil production increased 5% and Venezuelan crude oil production increased 62% from 2020 to 2024. World crude oil exports followed crude oil production and increased from 40.7 million barrels a day in 2020 to 43.2 million barrels a day in 2024. The 6% increase from 2020 to 2024. Iranian export increased from 404,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 1,566,000 barrels a day in 2024. The 288% increase from 2020 to 2024. Despite Western sanctions, they found new buyers, India and China. In 2024, Iran exported to China 1.2 million barrels a day, other Asia 304,000 barrels a day, and Middle East 52,000 barrels a day. So China is very interested in sanctioned Iranian oil from 2022. Venezuelan exports increased from 487,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 656,000 barrels a day in 2024. The 35% increase from 2020 to 2024. In 2024, Venezuela exported 232,000 barrels a day to OECD Americas, 208,000 barrels a day to other Asia, and the rest to OECD Europe, China, India, and Middle East. Some of the exports to OECD Americas is compensation to American Oil Corporation for nationalized assets. And now let's take a look at the more expensive products, petroleum products, diesel, gasoline, jet fuel and alike, refined products that seller can sell for the higher prices and make a higher profits. Where petroleum products output increased from 85.5 million barrels a day in 2020 to 93.6 million barrels a day in 2024. The 9% increase from 2020 to 2024. Iranian petroleum products output increased from 1.5 million barrels a day in 2020 to 1.8 million barrels a day in 2024. That is 17% increase from 2020 to 2024. Venezuelan petroleum products output decreased from 339,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 268,000 barrels a day in 2024. That is 21% decrease from 2020 to 2024. World petroleum products exports increased from 27.8 million barrels a day in 2020 to 31.7 million barrels a day in 2024, the 14% increase from 2020 to 2024. Iranian petroleum products exports increased from 281,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 411,000 barrels a day in 2024, the 46% increase from 2020 to 2024. Venezuelan petroleum products exports increased from 70,000 barrels a day in 2020 to 218,000 barrels a day in 2024, the 211% increase from 2020 to 2024. And now let's look at natural gas global market. World natural gas production increased from 4.0 trillion cubic meters annually in 2020 to 4.2 trillion cubic meters in 2024, the 7% increase from 2020 to 2024. Iranian natural gas production increased from 249,630 million cubic meters in 2020 to 277,611 million cubic meters in 2024, the 11% increase from 2020 to 2024. Venezuelan natural gas production increased from 18,026 million cubic meters in 2020 to 22,586 million cubic meters in 2024, the 25% increase from 2020 to 2024. World natural gas export decreased from 1.4 trillion cubic meters in 2020 to 1.3 trillion cubic meters in 2024, or minus 4% from 2020 to 2024. As I said in a video about Russian crude oil, petroleum products and natural gas, this trend can be because of three factors: warm winters, full world storages that countries have filled in 2022, and due to a higher share of renewable energy in energy mix of world energy demand. But Iranian exports decreased more than the world average. Iranian natural gas export decreased from 11,520 million cubic meters in 2020 to 8,967 million cubic meters in 2024. That is 22% decrease from 2020 to 2024. Venezuelan natural gas export increased from 4,301 million cubic meters in 2020 to 11,052 million cubic meters in 2024. That is 157% increase from 2020 to 2024. Interesting fact: Iranian natural gas production increased by 11% and export decreased by 22%. So where is the rest? They officially increased domestic demand from 238,130 million cubic meters in 2020 to 268,644 million cubic meters in 2024, or by 30,514 million cubic meters, or by 14% from 2020 to 2024. So, I think something is fishy here. Or there are false reporting on productions, or some natural gas is via Russian companies sold to Russia and not reported because of sanctions. And the opposite happened in Venezuela. Natural gas domestic demand decreased from 13,725 million cubic meters in 2020 to 11,534 million cubic meters in 2024. That is 2,181 million cubic meters, or minus 6% decrease from 2020 to 2024. And that may be because of deteriorating living standards of local population. Put your comments below. I would like to hear from you. Do you think that will be the good thing if we lift sanctions on Venezuela and Iran? See you in the next video.